I was thinking about this idea of how we usually diagnose problems. Like, usually when we talk about a diagnosis, there's this inherent expectation of precision, right?
Yeah, like if it's physical, it's just binary.
Exactly. If we're looking at something mechanical or physical, it operates like engineering. You break your arm, the x-ray shows that jagged white line on the bone, and the doctor simply points to the film and says, well, there is the problem. It's broken or it's not.
And that provides a really profound sense of comfort for people. I mean, we are entirely wired to want our problems to be visible like that. We want them categorical.
Yeah, easily defined by a clear boundary.
Exactly. We just want to know exactly where the thread is coming from so we can fix it.
But today, we're leaving that comfortable binary world completely behind. We're taking you into a diagnostic landscape that is entirely murky, it's shifting, and honestly, it's deeply uncomfortable for a lot of people to navigate.
It really is.
Because we're looking at this amazing stack of historical sources, philosophical texts, strategic notes, and they all circle around this one thing, the hidden mechanics of human emotion in high-stakes situations.
Which is just a fascinating area to explore.
It totally is. And specifically, the mission for this deep dive is to look at the profound, often catastrophic strategic cost of losing your temper. And on the flip side, the immense, almost terrifying power of remaining completely unflustered when you are under fire.
Well, the premise we really need to establish from these sources right out of the gate is it's a concept that challenges the way most of us operate every single day.
Right.
The texts argue that in the realm of power or strategy, social dynamics, absolutely nothing is personal.
Which is so hard to accept.
It is, but objectively speaking, anger and emotion are counterproductive to your survival. The moment you allow a conflict to become a reflection of your own ego, you've basically surrendered your footing.
Yeah, you've handed the operational strings of your own behavior right over to the person attacking you.
Spot on. You're no longer in control.
Okay, let's unpack this, because applying that phrase, nothing is personal, in real life feels incredibly unnatural.
Completely unnatural.
Right, because if someone stands in front of you and insults your intelligence or your character, or, God forbid, your family, every single biological instinct we have screams that it is intensely personal.
Your heart rate spikes, adrenaline floods the system.
Fight or flight response just completely takes over. So to truly understand what our sources mean by stripping that personal ego out of the equation, we need to examine what happens when the most powerful person in a room forgets that rule.
Yes, we need to dissect a historical moment where things went terribly wrong.
Exactly. A moment when the conqueror of Europe allowed a strategic interaction to become deeply, humiliatingly personal.
We are looking at January 1809, the Napoleon transgression.
This is such a wild story.
It is arguably the ultimate historical case study in the complete collapse of emotional structural integrity.
Let's construct the environment for you here, because the physical context of this meltdown is so crucial. So it's Napoleon Bonaparte, Emperor of the French, and he has essentially rewritten the entire map of Europe through sheer military genius and willpower.
Right, he's at the height of his power, theoretically.
Theoretically, yeah. But right now, he is rushing back to Paris from his military campaigns in Spain, and he is highly agitated.
Because the Spanish War has devolved into this bleeding quagmire, just a brutal guerrilla war draining all his resources.
But the military situation isn't actually what has his stomach tied in knots, right?
No, it's not. His vast network of spies has whispered this rumor in his ear that just has him completely panicked.
And the intelligence suggested this burgeoning conspiracy back in the capital, but the threat wasn't coming from a foreign power.
It was coming from inside his own house.
Exactly. The rumor detailed a secret alliance between two of his most formidable, just lethal ministers, Charles Maurice de Talleyrand, his former foreign minister, and Joseph Fouche, his minister of police.
And to give you a sense of these two men, Talleyrand and Fouche are not just, ordinary bureaucrats.
Not at all.
They are legendary political survivors. They successfully navigated the deadly shifting tides of the French Revolution, the bloody reign of terror, the Directorate, and the rise of the empire itself. They're basically apex predators in the political ecosystem.
So Napoleon arrives at the Tuileries Palace in Paris, and he's heavily burdened by these rumors, and he immediately summons his ministers to a meeting. And the atmosphere in that room, it would have been suffocating.
You really have to consider the sensory details of that space. The overwhelming opulence of the palace, contrasted with the heavy, just terrified silence of the lesser ministers gathered there.
Yeah, they're acutely aware that the emperor is enraged, but they have no idea where the lightning is going to strike.
Right, they are frozen, just waiting for the executioner's axe to fall.
And then Napoleon bursts into the room, but he doesn't take his seat at the head of the table to preside over the meeting. He begins pacing.
Pacing erratically.
Walking erratically up and down the length of the room, just rambling. The sources describe him vaguely ranting about plotters working against him in the shadows.
He's complaining bitterly about speculators bringing down the stock market. He's yelling about legislators delaying his policies.
And broadly insinuating that his own inner circle is undermining his authority.
What we are observing here is the physical manifestation of a man burning through his own cognitive reserves.
Literally exhausting himself.
Exactly. He's expending kinetic energy, moving anxiously, while the man he's truly targeting with this display is doing the exact opposite.
The visual contrast in this room is the entire lesson. Because while Napoleon is pacing and sweating and ranting, the sources focus on Talleyrand.
And what is Talleyrand doing?
He is simply leaning against the mantelpiece. He is looking completely indifferent. His posture suggests profound boredom.
Which is incredible.
Imagine the psychological dissonance of that. You're the emperor, a man who commands massive armies, and your subordinate is observing your rage as if it were a slightly tedious amateur theatrical performance.
It creates a massive power imbalance, just disguised as passive insubordination.
Oh.
So Napoleon finally stops his pacing, plants himself directly in front of Talleyrand, and he says, for these ministers, treason has begun when they permit themselves to doubt.
And the use of the word treason in 1809 under Napoleon's regime, that is not a casual HR reprimand.
No, definitely not.
It's a word that precedes a firing squad.
Napoleon is delivering a death threat, and he's fully expecting that biological response we mentioned earlier. He expects Talleyrand's heart rate to spike.
He expects him to drop to his knees, right?
Exactly. To beg, to defend himself frantically, to show deference and absolute terror.
But Talleyrand merely smiles. He remains glued to the mantelpiece, completely serene.
And that absolute refusal to participate in the emperor's emotional reality is just the match in the powder keg.
It really is. The sight of a subordinate maintaining a flat resting heart rate in the face of death charges pushes Napoleon entirely over the edge. He steps intimately close to Talleyrand, and when Talleyrand just stares back completely unfazed, Napoleon detonates.
And the historical accounts of this specific escalation are remarkable because of how quickly the imperial facade just crumbles.
It's totally gone.
Napoleon screams directly into Talleyrand's face. He calls him a coward. He yells that Talleyrand is a man of absolutely no faith, declaring, "Nothing is sacred to you. You would sell your own father."
Wow.
He even weaponizes their shared history, reminding Talleyrand that he had showered him with unimaginable riches, and yet Talleyrand would still conspire to destroy him.
And the other ministers in the room are watching this in sheer paralyzed disbelief. They're accustomed to Napoleon's battlefield temper, sure, but they have never witnessed him unravel like this in a diplomatic setting.
He's losing it.
He starts literally stamping his feet on the floor like a frustrated toddler. He screams, "You deserve to be broken like glass."
Which is such a weirdly specific threat.
Right. And he reminds Talleyrand that he has the supreme power to crush him instantly, but claims he has too much contempt to even bother. He loudly questions why he hasn't already had Talleyrand hanged from the gates of the palace, and then adds this ominous caveat, but there is still time for that.
It's just a complete degradation of authority. Napoleon is yelling so forcefully he's running out of breath.
The sources say he was turning red, right?
Yeah. Observers noted his face had turned deeply red, his eyes were bulging, and then he abandons geopolitics entirely and goes straight for the gutter. He screams the famous line, "You are nothing but shit in a silk stocking."
Which is an incredibly visceral, ugly insult. But he doesn't stop there. Having failed to break Talleyrand with threats of execution and bodily harm, Napoleon resorts to, high school level gossip.
It's so petty.
He throws Talleyrand's marital issues into the pub forum. He yells, "What about your wife? You never told me that San Carlos was your wife's lover." He is attempting to publicly cuckold and humiliate a geopolitical mastermind in front of his peers.
Which brings us to the masterful deflection. How does a man respond to being screamed at, threatened with a hanging, and mocked over his wife's infidelity by the most powerful man on the continent?
This is the best part. Talleyrand looks at this sweating, red-faced, hyperventilating emperor and delivers a line of such supreme, chilling calmness. He says, without raising his voice a single decibel, Indeed, sire, it did not occur to me that this information had any bearing on your majesty's glory or my own.
Just incredible. It's an unparalleled neutralization tactic.
It really is.
Talleyrand treats the emotional vitriolic attack as if someone had just handed him a slightly misfiled piece of administrative paperwork. He refuses to defend his wife's honor, he ignores the accusations of treason, and he doesn't even acknowledge the insults to his character.
He simply points out the profound, almost embarrassing inappropriateness of the emperor bringing it up in the first place.
Exactly. And Napoleon is so completely deflated by this wall of apathy that he just sputters a few more incoherent insults, turns on his heel, and walks away.
And then we get the legendary coda to the scene. Because Talleyrand slowly pushes himself off the mantelpiece, and he had a clubfoot, so he moved with a very characteristic, deliberate limp.
Right.
He slowly crosses the silent room toward the exit. An attendant helps him drape his heavy cloak over his shoulders, and before he leaves, he turns back to the huddle of terrified ministers, lets out a gentle sigh, and says, "What a pity, gentlemen, that so great a man should have such bad manners."
What's fascinating here is analyzing the why behind the fallout of this encounter. After expanding all that energy, after screaming about hanging him and breaking him like glass, what consequences did Napoleon actually enforce?
Basically nothing, right?
Right. He banished Talleyrand from the court and relieved him of his immediate duties. But he did not arrest him, and he certainly did not execute him. Napoleon basically operated under this delusion that the public dressing down just the sheer volume of his anger would serve as sufficient punishment to humble a proud aristocrat.
Which exposes a fatal misunderstanding of the opponent's psychology.
A catastrophic misreading. Because the historical sources we are examining present a highly compelling theory regarding this interaction. Talleyrand and Fouche likely engineered this exact scenario.
Wait, really? They planned it?
It's highly probable. They knew Napoleon was feeling the immense strain of the Spanish campaign. They understood the fragility of his ego regarding his absolute control over Paris. They likely intentionally leaked the rumor of their own conspiracy, specifically to test his emotional structural integrity.
They wanted to see what would happen when they applied pressure to a hairline fracture.
Exactly. And the entire structure collapsed. If it was a test, Napoleon failed it in the most spectacular public way possible.
And the consequence wasn't isolated to just a bad afternoon at the palace either. Word of Napoleon's tantrum spread like a contagion.
You can't keep something like that quiet.
No, you cannot have the Emperor of the French screaming about silk stockings and marital affairs in front of the entire cabinet without that narrative leaking to every royal court in Europe. It completely shattered the aura of his invincibility.
For the first time, the world saw the great conqueror lose his composure under fire.
It bred this creeping sentiment that he was losing his grip. Talleyrand himself noted privately, this is the beginning of the end. And historically, this moment really foreshadowed the increasingly erratic, catastrophic decisions Napoleon would make in the coming years.
Culminating in the disastrous 1812 invasion of Russia, and ultimately, Waterloo.
I want to map this onto a modern environment for you, because obviously most of us aren't dealing with European emperors threatening to hang us from palace gates.
Faithfully.
But think about the mechanics of a modern corporate meltdown. Picture a CEO, a department head, or even just a shift manager having a screaming fit in a glass boardroom or like on a company-wide Zoom call.
Oh, we've all seen it.
Someone misses a critical quarterly target, a major client pulls out, and the leader just loses it. They start raising their voice, hurling personal insults, throwing their weight around to demonstrate how much they supposedly care about the failure.
And the immediate reaction in that room is always silence.
Hmm.
Just fear masquerading as respect.
Right. The junior employees will stare down at their legal pads. Nobody is going to interrupt the screaming boss. But think about the sociological mechanics of what happens the exact second that meeting adjourns.
The private Slack channels just light up.
The text threads among colleagues explode. The respect evaporates instantly, replaced by a deep, lingering secondhand embarrassment. The team immediately begins questioning that leader's capacity to handle an actual crisis.
You haven't inspired loyalty, you started a countdown clock.
Every talented person in that room is silently updating their resume, counting the days until they can escape a volatile environment. Showing that level of unfiltered frustration reveals fundamentally that you have lost the power to shape events. It's no longer a demonstration of authority. It's the helpless thrashing action of a child having a hysterical fit because the world is refusing to bend to their will.
When you expose your internal chaos through stormy eruptions, you are heralding your own decline. Just think of the options Napoleon had at his disposal before he opened his mouth.
He had so many options.
He could have quietly deployed his secret police to investigate the conspiracy.
Hmm.
He could have isolated Talleyrand and Fouche, systematically stripping them of their influence without ever raising his voice. He could have even manipulated them into betraying each other.
But the biological reality of anger is that it drastically narrows your cognitive bandwidth.
Once you are screaming, your peripheral vision closes. The only tool you have left in your arsenal is volume.
Okay, let's unpack this further. If Napoleon serves as the ultimate cautionary tale, the glaring example of how an emotional meltdown can literally cost you an empire, the practical question becomes, how do we actually maintain the composure of a Talleyrand?
Right, how do we do it?
How do we find the biological and psychological fortitude to lean casually on a mantelpiece when someone is screaming in our face? Because intellectually knowing it's a bad idea to yell back is entirely different from physically stopping your hands from shaking and your heart rate from spiking.
This is where the source material transitions from historical observation into a deeply functional psychological framework.
But I need to challenge this framework before we dive in, because I know exactly what you were thinking. Modern psychology has spent decades telling us that repressing our angry emotional responses is deeply unhealthy.
It is.
We're constantly told not to bottle things up. If a coworker calls me a coward to my face or intentionally undermines my work, just standing there and smiling feels like I am internalizing a toxic substance. It feels like I'm letting them win while my own stomach acid eats a hole in my lining.
That is a vital distinction to make, and the texts we're analyzing explicitly warn against the dangers of repression. Repressing anger is exactly the scenario you just described, biting your tongue, swallowing the poison, and holding it in your body.
Which is terrible for you.
It really is.
Yes.
Repression demands massive amounts of psychological energy. It inevitably leaks out later in the form of strange, passive-aggressive behavior, or it manifests physically in deteriorating health.
So what's the alternative?
The strategic goal here is absolutely not to hold your breath until you turn blue just to maintain a poker face. The solution the text advocate is a fundamental structural perspective shift.
A perspective shift sounds great in theory, but how does that operate mechanically when you are actively under attack?
It requires an intellectual detachment from the immediate trigger. You must internalize the reality that when someone directs an explosive outburst at you, their anger is almost never exclusively about the present moment, or even about you.
It's about their own stuff.
Exactly. Human beings are incredibly complex accumulations of past experiences. Everyone is caught up in the sprawling chain of events that predates your interaction by decades. When a boss or a colleague explodes over a minor error, that volatility often stems from unhealed childhood dynamics, inherited family traumas, deep-seated insecurities, and the heavy accumulation of daily disappointments.
They're bringing all of that into the room.
You might appear as the immediate trigger for their rage, but the powder keg was filled long before you ever arrived.
Let me translate that into actionable advice for you. When you are standing in that room and someone is losing their mind, throwing a tantrum directed at you, the thought you need to hold in your head is this. Do not be vain enough to think this is entirely about you.
Framing it as an issue of vanity is incredibly effective. Assuming that someone's complex emotional breakdown is solely a reaction to your behavior is, frankly, an act of supreme ego.
It really centers you in a narrative where you are actually just a bystander.
Exactly. When someone throws a tantrum, you must learn to view their emotional outburst objectively, as a disguised power move or a mechanical failure. It is an attempt to exert control over you, cloaked in the language of hurt feelings or righteous indignation.
They feel powerless, so they're lashing out.
They feel utterly powerless in their own internal lives, so they're trying to drag you into their chaos to make themselves feel impactful. Once you genuinely recognize that the tantrum is a symptom of their own weakness and historical baggage, detaching becomes a natural byproduct, not a forced repression.
That makes so much sense.
You don't have to swallow the poison, because you suddenly realize they aren't actually handing you poison, they are just spilling it all over themselves.
No.
You are observing a machine misfiring.
And there is a story from the sources that perfectly illustrates this concept of mechanical detachment. It takes us to 17th century Japan. We are looking at a Kyoto judge. His official title was the Kyoto Shoshidai, named Itakura Suonokami Shigemon.
And Shigemuni's had a very formidable reputation.
He did. He was known as a brilliant thinker, deeply fond of the quiet discipline of the traditional tea ceremony. But as a judge, he heard incredibly complex, frustrating lawsuits all day long.
And the primary requirement of a judge is absolute, unwavering impartiality and clarity of thought.
Which was exactly what Shigmin was struggling with. One day, he asks a close friend of his, a tea merchant named Iki, to provide some honest feedback. He wants to know the unvarnished public opinion regarding his performance on the bench.
Risky question.
Very. And Iki gives it to him straight. He says, "The people say that you get easily irritated with litigants who stumble over their words or don't present their evidence clearly. You scold them sharply. Because of this reputation, people are terrified to bring their legitimate grievances to your court."
That's a brutal assessment.
It gets worse. He says, "And when they do appear before you, they're so flustered by your sharp tongue and your visible annoyance that they forget their arguments, and the truth of the matter never actually comes out."
Consider the psychological weight of that moment. This is a powerful, highly respected man being told by a friend that his lack of emotional control is actively destroying his life's work. It is preventing justice.
The standard human reaction for anyone in authority would be immediate, aggressive defensiveness.
Oh, absolutely. They would justify their anger. They would say, if these peasants would just learn to speak clearly or prepare their cases, I wouldn't have to raise my voice. I am just enforcing standards.
Right, the classic defense mechanism of making your anger someone else's fault. But Shigemyun completely bypasses that ego trap. He embraces the perspective shift.
How so?
He tells his friend, "I am glad you have told me this. Upon reflection, I have fallen into the terrible habit of speaking sharply. I forget that humble folks who are not accustomed to public speaking get easily flurried. I will ensure this does not occur in the future."
Wow, he just accepts it.
He recognizes the catastrophic strategic cost of his temper, that it's hiding the very truth he is supposed to uncover. So what is his solution? He doesn't just make a flimsy mental promise to try harder to be nice. He engineers a physical somatic system to guarantee his emotional regulation.
He builds a mechanism to bypass his own flawed psychology.
Exactly. He takes a traditional tea mill, a heavy device used to grind tea leaves into the ultrafine powder required for the tea ceremony, and he places it directly on his desk in the courtroom. He sets up a paper screen, a shoji, so the court cannot see him directly, but he sits behind it during every trial. And as he listens to the endless, frustrating, convoluted cases, he manually grinds his own tea.
We have to unpack the biology of what is happening here because it's brilliant.
Yeah.
He basically constructed a real-time biofeedback loop for his autonomic nervous system.
Because anyone who has ever ground traditional matcha knows it requires a highly specific, rhythmic, perfectly even motion.
Right. If your mind wanders, or more importantly, if your heart rate spikes and you get agitated, you inevitably start grinding too fast or pressing too hard.
And when you do that, the tea leaves don't grind properly. They fall unevenly, the friction burns the powder, and the consistency is completely ruined.
So the tea mill acts as an external monitor for his internal state. By focusing a portion of his cognitive load on the smooth, methodical rotation of the mill, he anchors his physical body. The rhythmic motion likely stimulates the vagus nerve, which actively suppresses the fight-or-flight response of the amygdala.
It's like a physical tether to calm.
Precisely. If a witness started rambling and Shigemyun felt that familiar flash of annoyance, he would simply look down at the mill. If the grinding became erratic or the powder fell unevenly, it was undeniable physical proof that his composure was failing.
And that visual and tactile feedback allowed him to instantly recalibrate his breathing and his mind before he ever spoke a harsh word.
The sources record that because he implemented this practice, his court became renowned for its impartial justice, and citizens left his presence deeply satisfied that they had been heard.
He removed his personal ego from the conflict entirely and replaced it with a heavy stone anchor.
Which is a deeply practical approach that perfectly mirrors the philosophical architecture provided by Arthur Schopenhauer in the texts we are reviewing.
Yes, Schopenhauer's rule.
Schopenhauer's writings provide what we might call the cold-blooded rule. It is a stark, almost clinical way of analyzing social interaction, but its effectiveness is undeniable.
What does he argue?
He argued fiercely that animosity should never, under any circumstances, be displayed in your words or your facial expressions. He described the outward expression of anger as an unnecessary proceeding, dangerous, foolish, ridiculous, and vulgar.
I really want to focus on his use of the word vulgar because it strips away all the cinematic romance we associate with anger.
It really does.
We often culturally code anger as a sign of passion or strength or deep conviction. And Schopenhauer is looking at it and saying, no, it's just tacky. It frames losing your temper as a fundamental lack of refinement, a failure of basic self-governance.
Schopenhauer is asserting that broadcasting your emotional state, Wearing your heart on your sleeve when it involves hatred or rage is a catastrophic strategic error. His rule dictates that anger should only ever be felt in your actions.
Right.
The execution of your strategy, the quiet maneuvering of your resources, should be the only place your opponent feels the weight of your displeasure. He uses a chilling biological metaphor to hammer this home. He writes, "It is only the cold-blooded animals whose bite is poisonous."
Okay, I have to push back heavily on this because advising people to become cold-blooded animals sounds dangerously close to advocating for sociopathy.
I can see how it sounds that way.
If we never show our emotions, if we are completely silent and then just quietly bite the people who cross us with lethal precision, doesn't that make us manipulative monsters? I mean, how do you maintain healthy relationships if you operate like a silent, venomous snake?
That concern really highlights the crucial boundary between the personal sphere and the strategic sphere. Schopenhauer is not offering marriage counseling here.
Fair enough.
He is not advising you on how to interact with your children or your closest trusted friends. In the intimate sphere, vulnerability and emotional transparency are the foundational building blocks of trust. But the texts are focused on the strategic realm, the boardroom, the political arena, the marketplace.
Where the stakes are different?
Very different. In these environments, the people opposing you are actively looking for leverage. If you bark like a dog every time you are upset, you are constantly giving away your coordinates. You are telling your enemies exactly what bothers you, how much energy you have, and when you are distracted.
While the snake stays hidden?
Exactly. The cold-blooded animal, the snake, is silent. It remains completely still, absorbing the environment. The opponent has no idea it is angry until the venom is already coursing through their veins.
Well, let's bring that back to Talleyrand for a moment to really solidify the concept. In that explosive encounter in the Tuileries Palace, Napoleon was the barking dog. He was expending all his metabolic energy, showing every single tooth in his head, telegraphing his exact emotional state to everyone in the room.
And Talleyrand was the cold-blooded animal.
He remained perfectly still. He absorbed the deafening noise, showed absolutely zero animosity in his facial expression or his measured words, and he saved his venom, his intricate, behind-the-scenes orchestration of Napoleon's eventual downfall for his actions over the subsequent years.
So we have thoroughly established the defensive necessity of maintaining your own calm. We know we must strive to be the judge grinding the tea or the cold-blooded animal observing the room, but the source material does not stop at defense.
No, it pivots to offense.
Once you have achieved mastery over your own emotional regulation, the next strategic evolution is learning how to weaponize your enemy's lack of calm against them. How do you actively, purposefully stir the waters to draw them out?
And this brings us to a historical masterclass in psychological manipulation and the deadly art of strategic baiting. We are traveling to Ethiopia in the late 1920s to observe the tactics of Haile Selassie.
Now, this specific juncture in history, Haile Selassie is not yet the globally recognized emperor. He holds the title of regent, serving under the Empress Zaidu II, and he is the presumptive heir to the throne.
And Selassie is a visionary leader with a deeply held belief. He knows that for Ethiopia to survive the encroaching modernization of the world and the looming threat of European colonialism, the country desperately requires unified, centralized leadership. He has spent years playing the long game, systematically weakening the fractured power bases of various regional warlords. But he faces one massive existential obstacle.
The Empress Zaidu II herself, and more critically her husband, a very powerful nobleman named Ras Gugsa.
Selassie is operating under no illusions here. He knows with absolute certainty that the royal couple harbors a deep, venomous hatred for him. They view him as an upstart and a threat to their traditional power, and they are actively, continuously plotting his assassination or political ruin. It is a high-stakes waiting game.
And a lesser political operator in Selassie's position would have relied on crude tactics. They might have hired assassins, attempted a clumsy military coup, or simply lived in a state of paralyzing anxiety waiting for Gugsa's plot to materialize.
But Selassie was smarter than that.
Much smarter. He deeply understands the psychological laws we are dissecting. He knows that if he allows Gugsa to orchestrate a strike on his own timeline, under his own conditions, the danger will be insurmountable. He cannot wait. He must draw Gugsa out into the open. He has to force the error.
So Selassie designs a brilliantly layered psychological trap. The first phase is geographical isolation. He officially appoints Ras Gugsa as the governor of Bejameter, a province in the north of the country.
On paper, it looks like a royal honor, a promotion of sorts.
Right. But strategically, it forces Gugza to physically relocate away from the capital of Addis Ababa, far away from the empress. He severs the immediate communication lines between the conspirators.
Isolation is the foundational step. But Gugza's a patient, cunning man. He accepts the governorship and plays the role of the loyal administrator for several years. He makes no overt, aggressive moves.
And Selassie observes this silence and understands it perfectly. The water in the pond is still, which simply means the fish is resting safely at the bottom, growing larger and finalizing its plans. To catch the fish, Selassie has to drop the bait.
And the bait he selects is a work of dark genius, because it is perfectly calibrated to Ras Gugza's specific psychological vulnerabilities.
Tell us about the Azebu Gallus.
So there was a fiercely independent northern tribe known as the Azebu Gallus. For years, this tribe had been in a state of virtual rebellion against the central throne. They were raiding local villages, ignoring laws, and outright refusing to pay royal taxes.
And Selassie had intentionally ignored them for years. He deliberately allowed the problem to fester and grow into a highly visible nuisance. Finally, in 1929, he springs the trap. He issues a direct, unyielding royal command to Ras Gugza. As the governor of the Northern Territories, I command you to assemble an army, march against these disobedient Azebu Gallus tribesmen, and crush their rebellion.
We must analyze the precise nature of this trap. Why is this specific order so devastating? Selassie is targeting Gugza's most volatile, uncontrollable emotion, his fierce aristocratic pride. That is the mechanism of the snare. Ras Gugza had absolutely zero personal grievance against the Azebu Gallus tribe. They were not his enemies. To receive a peremptory order to risk his own troops, expend his own vast wealth, and potentially die on a battlefield on behalf of a region he utterly despised. It was a calculated, massive insult to his ego.
He was trapped in a psychological paradox. He couldn't refuse the military order without publicly appearing as a coward or committing premature treason before his plans were ready. But obeying the order and fighting Selassie's battle for him felt like swallowing ground glass.
The emotional friction of that paradox was completely intolerable.
Yeah.
It pushed Gugza into acting before he was logically ready. The bait worked. He completely lost his composure.
Instead of executing a calculated resistance or simply fighting the tribe while biding his time, Gugza initiates a massive, chaotic, emotionally driven escalation. He starts desperately spreading wild, inflammatory rumors.
What kind of rumors?
He tells anyone who will listen that Haile Selassie is secretly a Catholic sympathizer, that he is colluding with the Pope in Rome, and that Selassie's ultimate plan is to hand the sovereign nation of Ethiopia over to Italy as a colonial prize.
Which was a massive deal at the time.
Huge. Gugza weaponizes this religious fear-mongering to recruit a massive, unwieldy force. He swells his ranks to an astonishing 35,000 men, and then, abandoning all tactical sense, instead of marching north against the tribe as ordered, he turns his entire army south. He openly declares a holy crusade and begins marching directly on the capital to depose and murder Selassie.
In Gugza's mind, he has boldly seized the initiative. He believes he is the protagonist of a righteous, holy narrative. He is entirely blind to the reality that he is just a furious Fouche that has bitten a heavily barbed hook and is currently being reeled into a manufactured whirlpool.
Because Haile Selassie had already wargamed every single step of this reaction, this is the stark contrast between emotional reactivity and cold, calculated strategic planning. Long before Selassie ever issued the order to fight the tribe, he had been doing the quiet work of the cold-blooded animal. He had already secured the absolute, unwavering support of the head of the Ethiopian Orthodox Church. He had already quietly funneled massive bribes to several of Gugza's key military allies, securing their promise to abandon the rebellion when the crucial moment arrived.
So, as Gugza is marching his 35,000 men south, fueled by blind pride and the momentum of a holy war, Selassie unleashes a devastating psychological countermeasure.
And the tactical execution here is remarkably modern for the era. Selassie utilizes air power not to drop bombs, but to drop information.
Yes, as the massive rebel army is marching through the terrain, Selassie's airplanes fly low overhead. They drop tens of thousands of printed leaflets down onto Gugza's soldiers.
And the text of these leaflets is a psychological kill shot. They announce, with the full authority of the highest church officials, that Haile Selassie is recognized as the one true, legitimate Christian leader of Ethiopia. And crucially, the leaflets declare that Ras Gugza has been formally and officially excommunicated from the church for the sin of fomenting an unjust civil war.
Just try to comprehend the emotional whiplash experienced by an ordinary soldier in Gugza's army. They've been told they were marching on a holy crusade to save their religion. Suddenly, authoritative documents fall from the sky, informing them that they're actually fighting for a condemned, excommunicated heretic, and that their own souls will be eternally damned if they continue the march.
The emotional foundation of their entire movement is instantly, irreparably shattered.
The psychological warfare works perfectly. The soldiers begin deserting in droves. They melt away into the countryside, and when the two armies finally meet on the actual battlefield, the rebel force simply collapses.
Those key allies that Gugza relied upon, the ones Selassie had already bribed, they never show up. Gugza, trapped by his own hubris, refuses to surrender and is killed in the brief, chaotic fighting.
And in a dark, tragic coda, the Empress Saiditu, devastated by the news of her husband's death, dies just a few days later.
By April 30th, Haile Selassie issues a formal proclamation, and the path is entirely clear for him to be crowned emperor. He didn't just defeat his enemies, he used their own predictable pride to make them eradicate themselves.
This historical event really provides the perfect structural framework for understanding the text's core metaphor of the fish pond. Consider the dynamics of water. When the waters are clear, calm, and undisturbed, the fish reside deep below the surface. In that environment, they have the psychological space, the time, and the clarity to plot actions that they alone will initiate and control.
Your enemies are safe in those depths.
But the moment you stir the waters by dropping precisely calibrated bait, a calculated slight to their vanity, a subtle offense to their professional pride, a trigger tailored to their specific hatreds, the little fish lose their discipline. They cannot help but rise to the surface to investigate the disturbance.
And when they rise, they are operating on pure emotion. They become agitated. They start snapping blindly at whatever crosses their path, including the freshly baited hook you just dangled in front of them.
Exactly. As their anger mounts, their cognitive processing degrades. Their strategic vision narrows to a tiny pinprick focused solely on the object of their rage. Ultimately, they become trapped in the chaotic whirlpool you have engineered, expending all their energy fighting the current until they drown.
Haile Selassie did not overthrow Ras Gugza through superior battlefield tactics or overwhelming troop numbers. He defeated him by making him just angry enough to fight at the wrong time, in the wrong place, for the wrong reasons.
So we have thoroughly explored how to bait a trap by intentionally stirring the waters. But that naturally leads to a vital, highly practical question for you. What is the protocol when the waters are already churning, but you aren't the one who stirred them?
That's a great question. What happens when you find yourself in a highly volatile environment and the bait is dangling right in front of your face, practically begging you to react?
This leads us to a tactical maneuver that is incredibly difficult to execute in the moment, but devastatingly effective. The strategic power of the no response.
And to dissect the mechanics of the no response, the source material points us toward the War of the Three Kingdoms in 3rd century China, focusing on the brilliant, calculating military commander Chip Qiao.
This historical scenario presents a stress test that would crack the emotional foundation of almost any modern leader. Cao Cao is engaged in a brutal, high-stakes military campaign. The survival of his forces hangs in the balance. During the maneuverings, his intelligence officers intercept and uncover a hidden cache of enemy documents.
And when the advisors read through these papers, they discover something deeply horrifying, undeniable, written proof that several prominent generals within Cao Cao's own inner circle have been secretly colluding with the enemy.
It represents the ultimate betrayal of trust. The advisors, operating on shock and outrage, immediately rush the documents to Cao Cao. They urge him to do what seems entirely logical and necessary. Arrest the treacherous generals immediately, hold a tribunal, and execute them to cleanse the ranks.
Here's where it gets really interesting, because put yourself in his position.
Wow.
If you discover that the people you trust with your life and your army are actively selling you out, the overwhelming biological and emotional instinct is to demand blood.
Of course.
The standard leadership playbook says you execute them for treason, you mount their heads on pikes, and you make a terrifying example of them to reassert your absolute dominance.
That aggressive, retributive reaction is emotionally satisfying. It feels like the swift delivery of justice. But Cao Cao operated on a different cognitive level. He evaluated the situation strategically, completely divorcing his ego from the betrayal.
He saw the bigger picture.
He recognized that unleashing an angry, violent purge in that highly specific moment would be strategically disastrous. They were on the precipice of a critical battle. If he suddenly dispatched his guards to arrest his own generals, it would vividly highlight the massive scale of the disloyalty festering within his army.
It would broadcast a clear message to every single soldier that their leadership structure was fractured, treacherous, and weak.
You would essentially be doing the enemy's psychological warfare for them. It would completely obliterate troop morale at the exact moment he needed his men to fight with absolute conviction.
Paranoia would spread through the encampment like a virulent disease. Every soldier would look at the man next to him and wonder, is he a traitor too? Who is actually in charge here?
The anger required to execute them would have instantly cut off his avenues for victory. So instead of satisfying his ego, Cao Cao executes a masterstroke of emotional discipline. He orders the treasonous documents to be gathered, and he burns them to ashes in front of his advisors. He then commands that the entire matter be permanently forgotten.
He literally sets fire to the indisputable evidence of his own betrayal. He watches it turn to smoke.
Because he understood a fundamental law of power. Justice can wait. A powerful leader cannot survive if they allow their options to be constrained by temporary emotions. By burying his justifiable rage and burning the evidence, he maintained the vital illusion of absolute unity within his forces.
He kept the treacherous generals fighting on his behalf, secure in their ignorance, knowing full well he could deal with them systematically on his own timeline after the existential threat of the battle had passed.
He retained his intellectual clarity while his advisors were demanding an emotional reaction.
It is the ultimate demonstration of discipline over ego. And to highlight how rare that discipline is, the source material contrasts it with the sheer absurdity of the opposite behavior.
Yes, the fables.
The texts provide two incredibly vivid, memorable fables to illustrate the self-destructive nature of reactivity.
Fables endure in strategic texts because they crystallize complex psychological truths into easily retrievable mental models. They serve as cognitive anchors when you are under stress.
The first fable comes to us from 14th century Japan, found in the Essays in Idleness by the monk Kenko. It is the story of the ditch high priest.
A classic.
There was a local officer whose brother happened to be a high priest named Ryogaku. Now, Ryogaku was notorious for being an extremely bad-tempered, easily offended man. He was perpetually cranky. Well, right next to his monastery, there grew a very large, prominent nettle tree. Because the tree was such a landmark, the local villagers simply started referring to him casually as the Nettle Tree High Priest.
It was a mild descriptive nickname. There was no deep malice behind it.
A completely benign identifier. But Ryogaku's fragile ego cannot handle it. He becomes furious. He declares, "That name is an outrageous insult to my dignity." So, operating in a fit of reactive anger, he orders the massive tree to be chopped down. He thinks, "I have eliminated the source of the insult. Problem solved."
But of course, cutting down a giant tree leaves a massive, highly visible stump rooted in the earth. So the villagers merely adjust their vocabulary. They begin calling him the Stump High Priest.
By reacting to the initial slight, he didn't erase the joke. He simply provided them with updated material.
Exactly.
Now Ryogaku is pushed beyond mere annoyance into blind rage. He orders his monks to take axes and shovels, dig up the massive stump, and completely remove it from the grounds. They spend days engaged in exhausting labor, hacking at deep roots and tearing up the earth. When they finally manage to extract it, it leaves a massive, gaping, muddy ditch in the ground.
The punchline writes itself.
The villagers immediately start calling him the ditch high priest.
This fable is the ancient blueprint for the modern sociological phenomenon we call the Streisand effect. The psychological mechanism is universal. The harder you fight to suppress an embarrassment or an insult out of anger, the more oxygen you give it.
You draw immense public attention to the very thing you want ignored, and you inevitably compound your own suffering. Ryogaku literally spent days physically excavating his own metaphorical grave because he lacked the emotional fortitude to simply ignore a harmless nickname.
He completely lacked the power of the no response. If he had just ignored it, the name would have faded.
And the second fable from the text explores an even darker, more visceral consequence of reactivity. It's a 19th century tale called The Monkey and the Wasp.
This one is brutal.
It really is. A monkey is sitting peacefully in the branches of a tree, happily eating a piece of ripe fruit. A wasp flies by, sees the fruit, and begins pestering the monkey, aggressively demanding a share. The wasp is buzzing erratically, trying to intimidate the monkey with the threat of its sting. The monkey, largely unbothered, simply swats the wasp away, just a casual backhand to remove the nuisance from his food.
The monkey executes a calm, entirely proportional response to a minor physical annoyance.
Yes, but the wasp possesses a highly volatile, irritable psychology. The wasp interprets this casual swat as an unforgivable insult to its honor. It begins to use what the fable calls invective. It buzzes furiously, circling the monkey, delivering a barrage of insect insults.
And the monkey.
The monkey, completely indifferent to the noise, just continues eating his fruit and ignores the display. This absolute indifference drives the wasp completely insane. The fable states that the wasp so worked himself up into violent passion that, losing all consideration of the penalty, he flew to the face of the monkey and stung him with such rage that he was unable to extricate his weapon.
The wasp's anger is so all-consuming that it drives the stinger in with suicidal force, trapping it in the monkey's flesh.
The wasp physically tears itself away, leaving its stinger and its internal organs behind in the wound. The fable concludes by noting that the wasp entails upon himself a lingering death, accompanied by pains much greater than those he had inflicted.
Let's analyze the outcome there.
The wasp literally disembowels itself, choosing agonizing death over a bruised ego regarding a piece of fruit. The monkey receives a painful sting, certainly, but he survives and finishes his meal. The wasp is destroyed entirely by its inability to control its own passion.
These fables brilliantly illuminate the inherent self-destruction of the angry response. But the strategic deployment of calm goes far beyond simply ignoring your detractors or avoiding a sting.
It goes deeper.
Much deeper. The texts reveal a higher-level application. You can actively weaponize the appearance of weakness. You can use a calculated non-reaction as a devastating offensive maneuver. This brings us to the tactics of Sun-tzu, a renowned commander of the Qi armies and a devoted disciple of the strategic philosophies of Sun-tzu.
We are looking at a masterpiece of military deception rooted entirely in human psychology. Sun-tzu is tasked with leading his troops deep into the territory of the opposing Wei army, but he faces a catastrophic logistical disadvantage. The Wei forces outnumber his men 2-1. Engaging in a direct, symmetrical confrontation would result in the total annihilation of his army.
However, Sun-tzu possesses a critical piece of psychological intelligence. He knows the specific personality profile of the general commanding the Wei forces. He knows this man is notoriously arrogant, dangerously hot-headed, and fundamentally disrespects the fighting spirit of the Qi soldiers.
With that intelligence, Sun-tzu designs a strategy to aggressively feed the general's pre-existing biases. He decides to feign cowardice and weakness, turning the general's hot temper into the instrument of his own destruction.
As Sun-tzu's army crosses the border into Wei territory, he issues a highly unusual logistical command. He tells his quartermasters, "Let us light 100,000 campfires tonight."
They comply, creating a massive, intimidating footprint of fire across the landscape.
The next night, as they march further into hostile territory, Sun-tzu issues a new order. "Tonight, you will only light 50,000 campfires." And on the third night of the march, he commands, "Light only 30,000 fires."
He is deliberately, artificially shrinking the visible footprint of his army to construct a very specific narrative for the enemy scouts observing from the hills.
Those enemy scouts rush back to the Wei general and report the data exactly as they saw it. 100,000 fires, then 50,000, then 30,000. When the hot-headed Wei general hears these numbers, his arrogant brain instantly bypasses all critical thinking and leaps to the exact conclusion Sun-tzu engineered for him.
He buys it completely.
The general enthusiastically declares, "I always knew the men of Qi were pathetic cowards. After only 3 days of marching into my territory, the terror of my reputation has caused more than half of their army to desert."
The general's massive ego completely blinds him to the possibility that he is looking at a fabricated data set. He eagerly embraces the confirmation bias. He truly believes his sheer aura of intimidation has broken the enemy.
This blinding pride dictates his next fatal maneuver.
The Wei general is overcome by greed and bloodlust. He wants to chase down these fleeing cowards and slaughter them before they can cross the border back home. To move faster, he makes a catastrophic decision. He orders his slow-moving heavy infantry, the armored corps that provides his actual defensive strength, to stay behind.
He personally leads a lightly armed, highly mobile cavalry unit, rushing recklessly ahead to run down the retreating forces. In his blinded haste, he leads his men directly into a narrow, steeply walled, heavily forested pass.
Which is precisely the geographical choke point Sun-tzu had selected for the ambush. The Qi soldiers hadn't deserted at all. They had simply utilized the cover of darkness and the illusion of the campfires to maneuver into perfect firing positions along the ridges of the pass.
As the Wei general's light forces rush blindly into the confined space, the trap springs closed. They are completely surrounded. The arrogant general is killed in the initial volley, his elite forces are utterly decimated in the crossfire, and Sun-tzu subsequently mops up the remainder of the divided, leaderless Wei army with ease.
Let's extract the core mechanism of that victory. Sun Pin did not defeat the Wei general with superior numbers, better weaponry, or advanced technology. He defeated him by encouraging the general's egotism. He dangled the tantalizing prospect of a cheap, easy victory right in front of his face, and then stepped back, allowing the general's own hot temper and lack of critical analysis to march him directly into a slaughterhouse.
It is the Talleyrand tactic escalated to the scale of warfare. There is nothing more infuriating or more blinding to an aggressive opponent than a target that refuses to behave the way they are expected to.
When it serves your broader strategic goals to unsettle people, you must cultivate that aristocratic, bored, indifferent posture. You let them exhaust their cognitive and physical resources swinging at phantoms you have projected for them.
Exactly.
Let me pause our analysis right here because we really need to address a potential misinterpretation. Everything we have unpacked so far paints a vivid picture of emotional detachment and psychological baiting as the ultimate invincible superpower. We are instructing you to act like Talleyrand, to adopt the biofeedback discipline of the tea-grinding judge, to be the cold-blooded snake, and to lay traps like Sunpin.
Right.
So what does this translate to in everyday practice? Should we walk into our offices tomorrow and start subtly baiting everyone who annoys us? If my boss is a notorious hothead, is the advice to constantly drop little psychological tripwires around the department just to watch him melt down and look foolish?
This is exactly why the source material includes a massive, uncompromising caveat. This brings us to the concept of the reversal. To answer your hypothetical, no. Absolutely. Definitively no.
That is a relief because living in a state of constant psychological warfare sounds utterly exhausting.
The texts are extremely explicit on this point. When you begin actively playing with the emotional volatility of other human beings, you are handling highly combustible material. You must exercise extreme prejudice and caution, because the danger of selecting the wrong target is not just a minor setback, it can be existential.
The reversal.
The ironclad rule of the reversal is this: you must rigorously study your enemy before you ever consider dropping a line in the water. To return to our earlier metaphor, some fish are simply too large, and they are best left entirely undisturbed at the bottom of the pond.
The historical example the text provides to illustrate this warning is genuinely terrifying. It serves as a masterclass in catastrophic, fatal miscalculation. It takes us to the ancient world, to the legendary city of Tyre, the capital of Phoenicia, and involves a young, incredibly ambitious conqueror named Alexander the Great.
It is a study in the lethal consequences of hubris.
Tyre was an immensely wealthy, technologically advanced, and militarily powerful city, but its true confidence stemmed from its geography. Unlike the vast majority of ancient cities that were built on open plains and vulnerable to siege, Tyre was constructed on a rocky island just off the coast.
It was surrounded by deep, treacherous water and protected by massively thick, towering stone walls. The Tyrians felt utterly, inherently invincible.
Fast forward to Alexander the Great sweeping through the Orient. He is conquering every civilization in his path with unprecedented speed, but he has not yet turned his full attention to Tyre.
The leadership of Tyre observes Alexander's campaigns. They look at their impenetrable walls, they look at the churning seas separating them from the mainland, and they experience a surge of dangerous, unearned confidence. They decide they want to assert their dominance and establish boundaries with the young conqueror.
They send a delegation of ambassadors to Alexander carrying a highly arrogant, provocative message. They essentially declare, "We will agree to recognize you as the emperor in our official documents, but we will absolutely not permit you, or a single soldier of your army, to physically set foot inside our sovereign city to offer sacrifices to the gods."
It is a textbook, deliberate provocation. They are actively baiting him to see how he reacts.
And predictably, Alexander is enraged. He's a man who believes he's descended from gods. You do not dictate terms to him regarding where he is permitted to walk. He immediately marches his forces to the coast and initiates a siege.
But the Tyrians had accurately calculated the difficulty of their geography. Sieging an island fortress without a massive navy is a logistical nightmare.
It's brutal. For 4 grueling, bloody months, Alexander throws his resources at the city. He attempts to build a massive causeway through the ocean to reach the walls. He brings up massive siege engines, but the Tyrian defenses hold strong. They repel every assault.
Finally, Alexander, acting as a pragmatist, decides the strategic objective is no longer worth the massive hemorrhage of time, resources, and soldiers' lives. He decides he is willing to swallow his pride, come to terms with the Tyrians, and march his army onward to easier targets. He dispatches a new set of royal messengers to the city to negotiate a peace treaty.
This is the critical juncture. The leaders of Tyre have actually achieved their objective. They successfully baited the most feared conqueror on the planet, they withstood his initial emotional fury, and they have successfully forced him to the negotiating table on their terms.
But the Tyrians become deeply intoxicated by their own hubris. They feel so invulnerable, so smug, that they have baited Alexander the Great and survived, that they decide to unnecessarily twist the knife.
They don't just refuse the offer to negotiate, they violently murder Alexander's royal messengers, drag their bodies to the top of the highest walls, and throw their corpses into the sea in full view of the Macedonian army.
They misread the nature of the entity they were provoking. They stirred up a shark.
They pushed him right over the precipice. But we have to examine the vital, terrifying difference between baiting a man like Ras Gugsa and baiting a man like Alexander the Great. When you push a weak, insecure man over the edge, he flails, makes tactical errors, and drowns in the whirlpool you created.
When you push a man who possesses virtually limitless military resources, unbending willpower, and unparalleled strategic genius over the edge, his anger does not manifest as a clumsy tantrum. It crystallizes into a hyper-focused death sentence.
The historical sources document a chilling psychological shift in Alexander the moment he witnessed his messengers murdered. From that second forward, the constraints of time and resources evaporated. It no longer mattered to him if the siege took 4 months or 4 years.
It didn't matter how large a mercenary army he needed to finance, or how many warships he needed to requisition by force from other conquered nations.
He possessed the raw leverage to bend the world to his will, and the destruction of Tyre was no longer a military objective. It became a matter of absolute, uncompromising personal vengeance.
He remounts the assault with a ferocity and a maniacal intensity that defies reason. He successfully completes the causeway, breaches the supposedly invincible walls, and captures the entire city.
And because he was operating on a level of engineered rage, he doesn't just conquer the city and install a new governor. He makes an apocalyptic example of it that echoed through centuries of history. He ordered the entire city burned to the foundations. He had thousands of the surviving defenders systematically crucified in a line down the length of the beach.
And he sold the remaining population, some 30,000 men, women, and children, into brutal slavery. The entire civilization of Tyre was literally erased from the map because they didn't know when to stop baiting the hook.
This stands as the ultimate non-negotiable warning of the reversal. Psychological tactics, detachment, and baiting are powerful tools, but they do not magically negate the reality of physical, financial, or institutional power imbalances.
You can bait the powerful, and you might occasionally trick them into committing their forces unwisely, much like Sun Tzu did to the Wei general. But you are obligated to rigorously test the waters first. You must locate the structural gap in their strength.
If there is no gap, if the entity you are dealing with is impossibly strong, if they possess vastly more capital, more social leverage, or more institutional authority than you do, you have absolutely nothing to gain and quite literally everything to lose by provoking their anger. Never, under any circumstances, stir up the sharks.
It is a deeply sobering reminder. If your boss is highly vindictive, possesses a fragile ego, but holds the unilateral, unchecked authority to terminate your employment and ruin your industry reputation, deciding to play Talleyrand and smirk at them during a meeting might just result in you being escorted out of the building by security. You have to respect the hierarchy of power.
We must address one final nuanced layer regarding the deployment of anger, which brings the entire philosophical framework of these texts full circle. We have exhaustively established that spontaneous, emotionally driven anger is a glaring symptom of weakness and a catastrophic strategic error. However, the sources do carve out an allowance for one highly specific, tightly controlled application of anger.
The concept of the controlled thunderbolt.
Yes. The texts acknowledge that there are rare, specific occasions when a well-timed, highly calibrated burst of anger can serve a positive strategic purpose. But the absolute key distinction is that this anger cannot be a genuine biological reaction. It must be entirely manufactured.
It is a theatrical performance, written, directed, and completely controlled by your higher cognitive functions. You predetermine exactly how loud your voice will get, precisely how many seconds the outburst will last, and exactly which specific individuals the anger will fall upon.
It reframes anger from being a biological reaction that controls you into a surgical tool that you wield.
But even with that caveat, the text issues a stern warning. These manufactured thunderbolts must be deployed exceedingly rarely. If you are constantly staging loud outbursts to intimidate your staff or your competitors, the tactic rapidly degrades and loses all efficacy. The people around you become desensitized to the noise.
The manufactured rage becomes predictable, and it ultimately appears just as tedious and ineffective as a genuine, uncontrolled tantrum. The entire psychological power of the thunderbolt relies entirely upon its extreme rarity and its shocking precision.
Let's pull all of these disparate threads together, because the ground we have covered today is immense. We began in the suffocating tension of the Tuileries Palace, watching Napoleon Bonaparte permanently damage his imperial aura by indulging in an option-destroying tantrum over rumors and silk stockings.
We dissected the biological and mechanical brilliance of the tea-grinding judge in Kyoto, who utilized physical biofeedback to remove his own ego from the pursuit of justice. We mapped the strategic genius of Haile Selassie, who knew exactly how to pluck the strings of Ras Gugza's aristocratic pride, forcing his enemy to drown in a manufactured holy war.
And we explored the counterintuitive, devastating power of the no response by watching Cao Cao burn his own treasonous documents alongside those unforgettable fables of the nettle tree high priest digging his own ditch and the violent wasp disemboweling itself over a piece of fruit.
And crucially, we tempered all of those offensive strategies with the existential bloody warning of Tyre. You must know the exact nature of your enemy, and you must never stir up a leviathan that you cannot survive.
So for you, listening right now, taking this all in, here is the immediate practical takeaway for your own life. The next time you are sitting at your desk and your inbox pings with a wildly unfair, aggressively passive-aggressive email from a colleague, or the next time someone tries to subtly provoke you in a crowded meeting, simply to deflect attention from their own glaring mistakes.
Do not let your biology hijack your brain. Do not immediately fire back a defensive response. Take a physical breath. Visualize Talleyrand, leaning casually against the marble mantelpiece, looking utterly, profoundly bored while the most dangerous man in Europe screamed in his face.
Let them flail. Let them expend their kinetic energy. Your aristocratic indifferent posture, your absolute refusal to validate their emotional reality or take their bait personally will be infuriating to them. But more importantly, it'll secure a massive, quiet, structural victory for your own dignity and your long-term strategic power.
This framework raises a highly relevant question for the modern era, and it is a thought I want to leave you to chew on. The texts have shown us brilliantly how to avoid becoming someone else's bait, and how to actively bait our enemies when necessary. But consider your daily role not as a combatant, but as a spectator.
I see where you're going with this. The digital environment.
We exist in an ecosystem fueled almost entirely by constant manufactured outrage. Every single time you open a screen, you are forced to watch public figures, politicians, cultural influencers, or even your own friends engage in vicious, highly emotional dogfights.
When you are watching those conflicts unfold in real time, you must apply this diagnostic X-ray and ask yourself, who is actually engineering this scenario? Are you merely an objective observer, or are you unwittingly absorbing their manufactured anger?
Because the moment you allow their performative, algorithmically driven rage to spike your heart rate and make you genuinely angry, you have surrendered your autonomy. You have become an unpaid, unwitting foot soldier in a cultural or political battle of someone else's design.
That is a deeply unsettling realization. You effectively become the wasp, violently stinging yourself and ruining your own day on behalf of an argument that doesn't even belong to you.
So the next time you feel a sudden, intense surge of outrage on behalf of a stranger on the internet, or you feel the overwhelming biological urge to jump into a public fray in the comment section, force yourself to pause. Take a breath and ask yourself, whose pond are you swimming in right now, and exactly who just dropped the bait?
A brilliant, provocative lens to view the world through as we wrap up.
Thank you for joining us on this exploration. Take these frameworks, build your own biofeedback systems, learn to lean on the mantelpiece, and keep your vision clear as you navigate the turbulent waters ahead.